Adventist History CarTalks with Pastor Kevin Morgan.
Welcome to CarTalks number 4. In our last episode, we gave some of the background for the Israel Dammon trial and looked at who he was and also what the Adventists in 1845 believed about the shut door and how that was elucidated through Ellen White's Exeter vision regarding the sanctuary in its two phases.
When we reconstruct the history, we have basically two sources. There's a third that we can remember that was the attorney who defended Israel Dammon. But the two main ones are the Piscaticus Farmer, which was a periodical that was the first almost court record, close to court record of what took place. It was somewhat abbreviated according to the author of it. And we have Ellen White's account of what took place. And within the court record from the periodical, we pick up certain aspects of the meetings that were held by the Adventists, and we see their view of Adventists, which was a rather negative view, because they were mostly Baptist, and their lens comes through sometimes even in their testimony. It's hard not to do that. You know, if I describe an event and I have an Adventist lens, I'm not going to describe it like a Catholic would, or perhaps a Methodist or some other denomination, because I have a certain way of describing it. If you're talking about death, in particular, people will describe it differently. If you talk about God's judgment, if you come from a Baptist background, you will talk about it differently. William Foy, when he described his visions, had a very Baptist view of things, and he talked about spirits, and there are some things that are very confusing there that are very different from the way that Ellen White would describe it. And that was true of some of the witnesses in the trial. Okay, so what do we know about what took place? Several people from the Carina, Exeter area traveled by sleigh, because it was winter time, down to Atkinson for the meeting. And the meeting was very different from traditional church meetings. And when the witnesses describe it, they would put a very negative slant on the meeting, because they were meeting in a home rather than in a church. In a church, there is occupancy for everyone to sit in a pew, and there's an order of service, and there is a certain expected order of events. Whereas at the meeting that took place in Atkinson, it was more free-flowing. There would be periods of time that there would be prayer. There would be periods of time that they would sing. There would be periods of time that there was preaching. And one of the key features of that meeting was that Ellen Harmon, not yet married, in her 18th year, was coming to share her vision. She had already shared it at her sister's house with the Adventists in that area. Then they had gone up to Orrington. There's a whole path that we can follow the visits that they made, and they were back to Atkinson. So these were in the first presentations that she had made of her first 3 visions, she describes, but principally the first one. And then once she went to Exeter, she had another vision to share. So what do the witnesses say? Well, about Ellen White, or Ellen Harmon, they would say that she laid on the floor for a good share of the meeting. That seemed odd to them. But she was not well, and there were few options for her, so we can understand why she would be on the floor. They had a few chairs, and those were reserved for women, probably the older women, and the younger women would sit on the floor, cross-legged. And men as well, and children would sit on the floor because there just wasn't room for others in chairs. There was a back bedroom. It was a house, and people could have gone back there, but she chose not to go back there, and with good reason, because they described a lady by the name of Dorinda Baker, who also claimed to be having revelations from God, going back there, and that they described her coming out with one of the Adventists, and described it two different ways. The Adventists described it as she had shared a message with the brother about his spiritual welfare, and the one who was a witness but was not an Adventist described it as saying that felt good, and so it made it look like there was some kind of sexual encounter that had taken place. But the other witness didn't see it that way, and so you have both of those kinds of testimony coming out. A principal part of their early meetings was to go back to New Testament standards and to look at the way that the early church met together. And one of the things that was clear to them was that the early church celebrated the Lord's Supper, and that they did foot washing. And so foot washing was emblematic of their servanthood and their humility before their brethren. Also, they practiced what Paul and Peter mentioned when both of them said to greet one another with a holy kiss. And so it was a form of greeting even between men and women, but it was not sexual, even though there are newspaper articles where they wanted to scandalize the Adventists and make them look lewd and immoral. But that wasn't the emphasis of their greeting. It was to greet one another in terms that were biblical, in the New Testament terms. Now, there were some things that were practiced that Ellen White didn't agree with, and one of those was men washing women's feet. New Testament practice described women as deacon servants of the others who helped to wash one another's feet, and also Mary Magdalene washed Jesus' feet, so she could countenance women washing men's feet. But when men washed women's feet, it had a different meaning to it, and she didn't agree with that, although some wanted to practice that. She was against it. When Dammon began to speak, he was describing the distinction between those who believed that Jesus was coming and those who had rejected that message. And he did speak in very strong terms against those that rejected the Advent message. Also, that came out in the testimony was that they encouraged young people to be baptized, to be prepared for Christ's return, to accept the message of Christ's soon return as an important part of their faith. And the testimony describes two young individuals, which I've been able to identify, daughters of some of the Adventists, who were committed to go and be baptized because they believed that Christ's return could be any time soon, and that they needed to have their hearts right. And so in that cold winter night, they went out, and Israel Dammon baptized those two young ladies. It must have been bitterly cold and frigid, the water, and we have no evidence that they were sickened by the experience, but it had to show quite a bit of commitment that they would be baptized in the dark of night with moonlight as their only source of light in baptizing. Ellen Harmon and James stayed behind. They were present. And then Israel Dammon and the young ladies returned to the house, and they continued their meeting, which would include different singing. And I was able to locate the tune for the song that they sang that was mentioned in the trial, and that Ellen White herself also mentioned in the trial. And putting those together, it's in my book, Glory, Glory, Glory. So you can sing that song like they did. When I was down in Egypt's land, and how that they came out of Egypt to follow the Lord. And that was part of their early experience. Where the difference comes in between the accounts, we can understand some of the differences based on the lenses of the witnesses. For example, a young man last name Lowton, who was second cousin once removed or something from one of the girls that was baptized, he described the encouragements that Ellen Harmon had for these young ladies. By the way, the young ladies were about the same age as Ellen, so it's interesting that they saw her as a woman, the vision lady, but they saw these others who are about the same age in their late teens as young people, as adolescents. But it was because of her authority in sharing the vision, perhaps, that made that difference. But as he reported it, she said, if you aren't baptized, you're going to hell. And we have no evidence in any of her earlier statements, her earlier writings, that she would have talked about hell as their outcome if they didn't accept the leading of God. So, in my thinking, this is a Baptist way of saying you're going to be lost. You're going to hell. Because that's the way that a Baptist would describe it, and he was Baptist. And so some of the differences, the discrepancies in the way that things were presented can be explained by recognizing the lenses of the witnesses. But the difference comes in when Ellen White describes the arrest of Israel Dammon in different terms than the arresting officer. The arresting officer was the brother-in-law of the judge, which is kind of interesting. It was a community, it was a very close community, and it was always a puzzle to me why they only, if it was a matter of vagrancy, which is what they were accusing Israel Dammon of, why they didn't also arrest other Adventists. But they arrested the Adventists who was from out of town. They didn't arrest the local believers because they're kinfolk and they had to live with them. But they arrested Israel Dammon in this way. Ellen White describes seeing men walking past the window and coming to the door and pushing their way into the door. So they had no reticence about pushing their way into the room. And Ellen White said that Dammon was on his feet, and that they took him by his arms and his legs. I guess it was about 4 arresting officers. But they were unable to get him out of the door, and they had different reasons why they couldn't move him out of the door. Ellen White said they did not resist him, did not resist the arrest, but that it was the power of God that laid Israel Dammon prostrate on the floor, and they could not lift him. The arresting officer said that the women came up and they clung to him and kept the men from being able to carry him out the door. Now, I don't know how 4 men holding onto arms and legs would not be able to overpower women who couldn't get the same grip on him because the men had hold of him. So how do you explain that? They left the room. Both of them agree that they left the room. And my view is that the arresting officer was embarrassed and had to come up with an explanation as to why he couldn't get them out. Was he shy about manhandling him to arrest him? No, because later when more people came in, they manhandled the woman to get Israel Dammon out of the building. At least they tried to, and they were unsuccessful again, until Ellen White says that she said, the Lord has shown me there's nothing to be glorified for God if you don't go with him. So he went of his own volition at that point. And it wasn't the manhandling that the sheriff gave as the reason for the arrest and how they were able to get him out of the room. So that was a discrepancy. And those who lean towards naturalistic explanations, who have never seen anybody slain in the spirit, would be inclined to believe the arresting officer that they were prohibited from arresting by their resisting arrest. But if you are inclined to believe Ellen White and the several witnesses who were there, who were Adventists, who knew what had happened, who disagreed with that view and they affirmed Ellen White's explanation, then you could look at it and say perhaps the sheriff didn't want to embarrass himself and therefore gave an explanation that is still embarrassing, just as much as the soldiers who explained why the body of Jesus was taken when that was their sole task, was to guard the body of Jesus, and that men and women had come and sneaked his body away in the night. It makes no sense to give their explanations, but it's naturalistically better than a supernatural one, and that's my view of it.
Those are some of the most important issues that have been brought up about the Dammon trial. If you have other questions about it, I have studied this exhaustively. Somebody asked me, how do you know? I said, well, you reconstruct history from the evidence. And so I brought together the 3 testimonies that I mentioned in this video and correlated it very carefully. So if you have some other questions that you'd like to ask, please put them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to respond to them. If there are questions that are significant enough, I can make another video and we can respond to that. Thanks for joining us. Take care.